Pelican Bay State Prison, the most dangerous yard in America. February 23, 2000. 200 men stood scattered across the exercise yard. Black prisoners on one side, Hispanic prisoners on the other. The air felt wrong. Too quiet, too still. Then someone moved. A weapon flashed, and the yard exploded into violence. Men crashed into each other with homemade knives. Guards screamed orders that nobody heard. Blood appeared on the concrete. More men joined the fight. The sound of bodies hitting the ground mixed with shouts and the clash of metal. Guards fired tear gas into the crowd. Nothing changed. They shot rubber bullets. The fighting continued. Men kept stabbing each other even as gas burned their eyes and rubber rounds struck their bodies. Then came the sharp crack of real gunfire. The guards had switched to live ammunition. 14 rounds from assault rifles cut through the yard. 16 men fell with gunshot wounds. 19 others bled from stab wounds. One man would never get up again. It took 120 guards 30 minutes to stop the violence. 50 homemade weapons lay scattered across the blood-stained concrete when it was over. This wasn't the first riot at Pelican Bay. It wouldn't be the last. But this moment showed the world exactly what this prison had become. A place where control was just an illusion, where violence lived in every corner, where the most dangerous criminals in California were locked away from society. But they weren't locked away from each other. And that made all the difference. 11 years earlier, California opened the doors to a new kind of prison. December 1, 1989. Pelican Bay State Prison sat on 275 acres near Crescent City on the far northern coast. Miles from any major city. Miles from most families who would visit. That distance was intentional. The state had toured maximum security prisons across America, looking for ideas. They found what they wanted in Florence, Arizona. A place called the Secure Management Unit. California copied the design and made it bigger, made it more isolated, made it more extreme. The centerpiece was the Security Housing Unit. Everyone called it the SHU, an X-shaped cluster of buildings that held 1,056 solitary confinement cells. Each cell measured 8 feet by 10 feet. Concrete walls, concrete bed, concrete desk, concrete chair, a steel toilet and sink combination. No windows to the outside world. Just fluorescent lights that stayed on 24 hours a day. The cells were organized into pods. 8 cells to a pod. 6 pods in each hallway. 132 such hallways in total. In the center of each pod sat a guard behind bulletproof glass, watching through perforated steel doors. The guard controlled everything with buttons. Could open one door at a time. Could let one prisoner out to shower. Could allow one man into the tiny exercise yard. The yards were concrete boxes, 10 feet wide by 26 feet long, sometimes called dog runs. A prisoner got 90 minutes there each day if he was lucky. Alone. Always alone. Around the SHU ran an electric fence carrying 50,000 volts. Enough to kill anyone who touched it. 3 gun towers watched over everything, staffed around the clock. This was where California sent the worst of the worst. Gang leaders. Men who had killed inside other prisons. Prisoners too violent for anywhere else. Men who would spend 22 to 23 hours a day in their cells. Men who might spend years, even decades, in complete isolation. The state believed this would break the power of prison gangs. Believed that separating the leaders from their followers would make California's prisons safer. But they were about to learn something important. You can lock a man in a cell. You can take away almost everything. But you can't take away his mind. And you can't stop him from finding ways to communicate. The men who arrived at Pelican Bay were different from ordinary prisoners. They had already proven themselves dangerous. Many wore tattoos that told stories. Stories of gang membership. Stories of violence. Stories of a life most people would never understand. These weren't amateurs. These were men who had spent years learning how to survive in the most brutal environments. Prison gangs like the Mexican Mafia and Nuestra Familia ran criminal operations worth millions. From inside their cells, gang leaders ordered murders on the streets. They organized drug deals. They commanded robberies. They controlled prostitution rings. Money laundering. Home invasions. All from behind steel doors and concrete walls. The gangs operated like military units. Strict discipline. Clear chains of command. New members went to school. Gang school. They learned how to make weapons from materials the prison had to provide. Toothbrushes sharpened into stabbing tools. Metal torn from door frames and shaped into blades. Elastic from underwear, rolled paper, and plastic spoons combined into crossbows that could fire through the mesh doors. The prison confiscated over 1,000 weapons in a single year. But more kept appearing. The gangs found ways to communicate despite the isolation. Messages traveled through visiting rooms. Notes passed during the brief moments when prisoners were moved. Some guards could be corrupted. Some visitors carried information. The system was supposed to be escape-proof, communication-proof, influence-proof. But human beings are creative, especially when their survival depends on it. Especially when they have nothing but time to think and plan. Guards tried to maintain control. They conducted searches. They monitored movements. They separated enemies. They watched for any sign of gang activity. But 70% of California's prisoners had some gang connection. At Pelican Bay, that percentage was even higher. The prison didn't just house gang members. It became their headquarters. A place where they refined their operations. Where they trained new recruits. Where they planned crimes that would happen hundreds of miles away. Violence became routine. 6 prisoners died in 1997, killed by their cellmates. Multiple stabbings happened weekly. Guards shot prisoners to stop fights. The body count kept rising. And everyone knew that the relative peace of any given day could shatter in seconds. Because in a place like Pelican Bay, violence wasn't an exception. It was the language everyone spoke. But Pelican Bay had another problem. One that didn't make headlines like the riots. One that happened slowly, quietly, in the isolation of single cells. Men were breaking. Not from violence. From the absence of almost everything. No human touch for years. No conversation face to face. No natural light. No color except gray concrete. Just the constant fluorescent glow and the sound of other prisoners shouting through steel mesh. Some prisoners had been in the SHU for a decade. Some for 15 years. Some for more than 20 years. Living in an 8 by 10 foot cell. Alone. Day after day. Year after year. The only physical contact came from pinky shakes. A prisoner would stick his little finger through one of the small holes in the cell door to touch another prisoner's finger as guards moved them down the hallway. That was it. That was all the human contact some men had known for years. Psychologists had a name for what happened to people in these conditions. Sensory deprivation. The human mind needs stimulation. Needs variety. Needs connection. Without these things, it starts to malfunction. Prisoners experienced paranoia. Hallucinations. Extreme anxiety. Some lost their grip on reality entirely. They would smear feces on themselves. Talk to people who weren't there. Scream for hours. The prison had to use restraints. Had to force-feed prisoners who stopped eating. Had to watch constantly for suicide attempts. In April 1992, a man named Von Dorch was serving 10 years for grand theft. He suffered from mental illness that got worse in the SHU. He smeared himself with feces. Guards took him to be bathed. 5 or 6 guards held him in scalding water while he was handcuffed. He received 2nd and 3rd degree burns over his body. A CBS News program called 60 Minutes broadcast the story in 1993. The brutality shocked viewers. Lawsuits followed. In 1995, federal judge Thelton Henderson ruled that Pelican Bay wasn't being run constitutionally. He ordered oversight. Demanded changes. Specifically addressed the excessive force by guards, inadequate medical care, inadequate mental health treatment, and the practice of housing mentally ill prisoners in isolation. But the fundamental system remained. The SHU continued operating. Men continued spending decades in solitary confinement. And the question nobody wanted to ask became impossible to ignore. If you take violent men and subject them to years of psychological torture, then release them back into society with almost no preparation, what do you create? Nearly all the SHU prisoners would eventually be released. They would go from 23 hours a day alone in a concrete box to walking free in a matter of weeks. No gradual adjustment. No therapy. No support system. Just out. And studies showed that prisoners held in long-term isolation were more likely to commit crimes again, more likely to be violent. The very system designed to make society safer might be making it more dangerous. On July 1, 2011, something unprecedented happened. Prisoners at Pelican Bay began refusing food. Not just a few men. Thousands. They weren't protesting violence. They weren't demanding release. They wanted basic humanity. They wanted warm clothes in the cold Northern California weather. They wanted a handball for the outdoor exercise hour. They wanted one phone call per week. They wanted adequate food. They wanted the possibility that their isolation might end after several years if they caused no trouble. The hunger strike spread. 6,000 prisoners across California joined. The action lasted 2 weeks. Prison officials made promises. The strike ended, but the promises weren't kept. So in July 2013, the prisoners struck again. This time 29,000 prisoners participated. Some refused food for 2 months. Dozens were hospitalized. On the 7th week, a judge signed an order about force feeding, though the meaning wasn't clear. But by then, legislators had promised to investigate solitary confinement policies. The strike ended. This time, real change followed. In 2015, after a class action lawsuit, California agreed to major reforms. No more indefinite isolation based solely on gang validation. Prisoners could only be sent to the SHU for committing new offenses while incarcerated. And isolation would be limited to 5 years maximum. Prisoners who had spent decades in the SHU finally saw paths back to general population. Some who had been isolated for 20 years or more began the long process of rejoining society. Pelican Bay itself began to transform. Empty SHU cells were converted. The prison added education programs. Tables and televisions in day rooms. Open cell doors during certain hours. Microwaves and telephones. Outdoor exercise yards with actual equipment. By 2024, Pelican Bay had something remarkable. A bachelor's degree program from Cal Poly Humboldt. The first at any maximum security prison in California. 400 men out of 2,200 total prisoners were taking classes. Staff members said the prison that once was one of the most violent in the country had changed. Violence had dropped significantly. Men who once would have spent their entire sentences in isolation were writing papers, giving speeches about personal growth, and planning for futures they never thought possible. The dangerous yard hadn't disappeared. The electric fences still carried 50,000 volts. The gun towers remained staffed. Violence still happened. This was still maximum security. These were still men convicted of serious crimes. Many still had gang connections. But something had shifted. The belief that the only way to control dangerous men was to break them had been tested for decades. And it had failed. The violence rates went up instead of down. The gang problem got worse instead of better. The recidivism remained high. What was working now wasn't softer. It was smarter. Give men something to lose. Give them education. Give them purpose. Give them a reason to change instead of a reason to hate. The riot that happened in February 2000 showed what Pelican Bay had been. A place where violence was inevitable. Where control was temporary. Where both prisoners and guards lived in constant tension. The bachelor's degree program in 2024 showed what Pelican Bay could become. Still secure. Still maximum security. But focused on preparing men for the day they would leave instead of just warehousing them until that day arrived. The question facing America's prison system is no longer whether places like Pelican Bay should exist. It's what those places should be trying to accomplish. Because almost everyone inside will someday be outside. And what they bring with them when they leave depends entirely on what we put into them while they're there.